She rose from her seat in the hushed, cavernous courtroom, a small, almost imperceptible tremor running through her frame. Her hand, equally small, lifted, a subtle gesture that seemed to ripple through the heavy air. Yet, amidst the droning monologue of the defense attorney and the rustle of papers, no one seemed to notice. No one, that is, except for one man. He sat perfectly still in the third row, a silent sentinel, a former tomb guard whose very essence had been honed to perceive what others, caught in the currents of the mundane, invariably missed. To the array of jurors, their faces etched with a weary familiarity, this was merely another fraud trial, a predictable ballet of legal maneuverings. To Judge Green, presiding from his elevated bench, it was simply another affluent defendant battling desperately to salvage his tarnished name. But when that little girl's hand made its delicate, swift motion, a single, fleeting movement that vanished almost as soon as it began, the entire trajectory of the case, and indeed many lives, was irrevocably altered. Because what remained unknown to all, not the sharp-suited attorneys, not the scribbling reporters, not even the burly bailiff standing a mere 2 feet away, was the profound, silent plea she had just uttered. She had given the international distress signal, and the only soul in that crowded room who registered its devastating truth was a man who had once dedicated a decade of his life to guarding the most sacred silence in America. Before we plunge deeper into the intricate web of the story, we invite you to share. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. And if you too believe that timeless virtues like honor, courage, and sacrifice still hold profound significance in our world, then join us in ensuring their enduring legacy lives on. The courtroom remained locked in a suffocating silence, a palpable stillness that preceded monumental shifts. You could almost feel the tension in the air, a thick, suffocating weight, heavy and pregnant with unspoken possibilities, like the charged atmosphere just before a violent storm breaks. In the third row, nestled on the left side, a man in a dark gray jacket sat with an almost unnerving stillness, his posture ramrod straight, his hands resting lightly, almost reverently on his knees. To any casual observer, he exuded an aura of profound calm, a detached observer. But his name was Evan Blackwood, a 32-year-old former tomb guard with the revered old guard at Arlington National Cemetery. And deep within him, every fiber of his being, every honed instinct, was screaming on high alert, vibrating with an almost primal awareness. At the opulent defense table sat Richard Kane, impeccably attired in a custom-tailored suit, his tie a perfect knot, his polished cuff links catching and refracting the overhead lights with every expansive gesture he made. He was the quintessential image of a man who had meticulously constructed his entire existence upon a foundation of flawless appearances and an unyielding drive to win. Next to him, on a small, dark wooden chair that seemed almost comically oversized for her, sat an 8-year-old girl. She was dressed in a navy blue cardigan, buttoned meticulously to the very top, a sartorial choice that spoke of rigid conformity. Her name was Clara. Her gaze was riveted to the highly polished courtroom floor, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, utterly motionless, a fragile porcelain doll amongst the sharp edges of legal battle. Then it happened. A minute movement so infinitesimally subtle, so swift and quiet, that the vast majority of people in the room would have simply blinked and missed it, if they had even been looking. But Evan didn't miss it. He couldn't. His very being, forged in the crucible of absolute vigilance, was trained precisely not to. Clara, with an almost imperceptible flick of her wrist, brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. As her small hand retreated, it closed into a tight, almost convulsive fist. Slowly, with a deliberate, haunting precision, she uncurled her fingers, then pressed that same fist into her open palm, a soft, silent thud that resonated only in Evan's mind. It lasted for less than a second, a blink and you miss it gesture. To anyone else, it was nothing more than an innocent, childlike fidget, a fleeting moment of distraction. To Evan Blackwood, it was something else entirely, something chillingly specific. The international distress signal. A silent, desperate cry for help, a universal plea understood by hostages held captive, victims of domestic abuse trapped in their homes, and, most heartbreakingly, by children rendered voiceless and unable to articulate their suffering aloud. Evan's chest tightened, a cold vice clamping around his lungs. He leaned forward, every muscle in his body coiling, tensing like a predator before a strike. He waited, his breath held hostage. Seconds stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension within him. And then, she did it again. This time, her movements were slower, clearer, almost deliberate in their silent articulation. Her eyes still cast downward, fixed on the polished floorboards as if she feared lifting them. That was the precise moment Evan rose. His movement was calm, measured, a soldier's ascent. His voice, though not raised, carried across the vast expanse of the courtroom, steady and unwavering, yet impossible to ignore, a resonant anchor in the turbulent air. Your Honor, he stated, his voice cutting through the thick silence as he pointed a steady finger toward the defense table. That child just gave a distress signal. The entire courtroom froze. In that singular, suspended moment, everything changed. To truly comprehend why Evan Blackwood, a man trained in the art of unwavering stillness, shattered the solemn decorum of that federal courtroom, one must first understand the man himself. For a decade, Evan had served with the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, an elite unit far better known by its revered moniker, the Old Guard. The majority of that time had been spent posted at the hallowed tomb of the unknown soldier within the sacred grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. That particular job, a sacred trust, doesn't merely shape a man. It redefines him, hollowing out the old self and forging a new one. Day after day, for hours on end, Evan marched in perfect, almost inhuman silence, his footsteps a rhythmic mantra. 37 steps forward, a precise, measured pause, then 37 steps back. His entire existence became an exercise in precision, a meticulous choreography of duty. His uniform, without a single flaw, was a second skin. His movements, exact and deliberate, were rituals of respect. And his mind, a finely tuned instrument, was trained to register every single detail, every microscopic shift in his environment, without ever betraying the slightest external reaction. He stood watch through the sweltering heat of summer, through the biting gales of winter storms, unyielding through the crackle of lightning and the blinding fury of blizzards. He had faced down curious tourists, confrontational protesters, even insidious threats, and through it all, his expression had remained an unyielding mask, never once cracking, never betraying the man beneath the uniform. Years of such relentless discipline had imparted upon him something extraordinarily rare, the profound ability to read an entire room, to absorb its secrets and undercurrents, without ever allowing the room to read him. When he eventually left the army, Evan had sought to construct a quiet, unassuming life for himself in Virginia. A small, Spartan apartment, a steady, predictable job at a security firm. But the habits, ingrained so deeply into his very being, refused to dissipate. He found himself constantly scanning exits, observing intricate patterns in human behavior, invariably noticing that one crucial detail that everyone else, lost in their own narratives, inevitably overlooked. That particular morning, Evan had no inherent reason to be present in a courtroom at all. It was Detective Mallory Ross, an old friend from a security training drill years prior, who had called him. Mallory now worked for Child Protective Services, a demanding role that often dealt with the darkest corners of human experience. She had uttered only a single, urgent phrase on the phone. "Evan, I need your eyes on something. There's a custody element buried deep within a financial case, and I've got a bad feeling about it." He didn't ask questions. If Mallory called, Evan showed up, no questions asked, no hesitation. And that was precisely how he found himself in courtroom 3, on the 3rd floor of a federal courthouse in Arlington, silently observing a wealthy businessman on trial for financial fraud. The defendant's name was Richard Kane, 45, a man of smooth, practiced charm, his words dripping with an unctuous persuasiveness. He was the kind of man who perpetually exuded the aura of a winner, even when the cards were clearly stacked against him, even when he was demonstrably losing. Beside him sat his wife, Diane, an embodiment of sculpted elegance and composed grace, her pearl necklace gleaming softly, catching the light each time she leaned forward in a studied pose. And next to her, almost an afterthought in the tableau, sat the little girl, Clara. At first glance, Clara appeared utterly perfect, a meticulously crafted image of childhood innocence. The neat navy cardigan, her hair impeccably combed, her hands folded primly in her lap. To everyone else, she simply looked like a remarkably well-behaved child, patiently enduring a thoroughly boring legal hearing. But Evan knew better. Her stillness wasn't born of discipline or polite boredom. It was something else entirely, something profoundly wrong. And when he witnessed that silent, desperate signal not once but twice, in less than a minute, a cold certainty settled over him. Mallory, with her sharp instincts, had been right. Something truly terrible was hiding in plain sight, an insidious darkness veiled by superficial decorum. Evan's training, sharpened to an almost preternatural degree by a decade of guarding the tomb, had taught him to scan crowds, to dissect every movement, to pick out the infinitesimal details that others, operating on a different frequency, would invariably miss. That instinct, now a finely honed weapon, was locked onto Clara with an unwavering intensity. She sat beside Diane Kane, her stepmother, a small silent figure dwarfed by the massive heavy oak chair. Her navy cardigan, a bastion against some unseen cold, was buttoned meticulously to the very top, despite the courtroom's oppressively warm air. Her small hands rested neatly on her knees, unmoving, almost frozen. Her shoulders were stiff, pulled taut like wires straining under an invisible, immense pressure. Diane, from time to time, would lean toward her, her hand resting lightly, almost possessively, on the girl's shoulder. To anyone else, it might have appeared as a gesture of protective affection, a maternal reassurance. To Evan, however, it was a subtle yet unmistakable act of containment. A hand placed with just enough subtle firmness to remind a child that she had no choice but to sit still, to remain silent, to disappear. Across the room, Richard Kane was deep in his testimony, his voice a smooth, commanding baritone that filled the room with practiced confidence. He spoke expansively about finances, about his pristine reputation, and with a knowing smile toward the jury, about his cherished family values, pausing at precisely the right moments to maximize his theatrical effect. But Evan wasn't listening to the carefully crafted words. His attention remained unyielding, locked entirely on Clara. Every time Richard spoke, Clara seemed to shrink, imperceptibly, deeper into her chair. Her knees pressed closer together, her chin dipped lower, her shoulders curled inward just a fraction more, as if her small body was attempting to become an even smaller target, to vanish from existence. Then came something small yet profoundly telling. Richard, in his testimony, casually uttered the word discipline. And Evan saw Clara flinch. It wasn't much, a fleeting spasm of fear, just enough for someone trained to see the microscopic tremors of the human spirit. Evan's pulse, usually a steady drumbeat, slowed, deepening into a heavy, deliberate throb. He had witnessed this before countless times. Children attempting to disappear in plain sight, their bodies folding in on themselves, consciously striving to occupy less space, their silence screaming louder than any spoken word could. Then came the first signal. Clara lifted one hand, her movements mimicking the innocent act of brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Her small fist closed, then, with a haunting grace, it opened, pressing firmly into her open palm. Smooth, subtle, deliberate. Evan froze, his heart seizing in his chest. The international distress signal. He had learned it years ago during a joint security seminar, a universal silent language for urgent help, taught in discreet shelters, whispered in embassies, and reviewed in military briefings. It meant only one thing, an unambiguous cry that pierced through the noise. Asterisk, I can't speak, but I need help. Asterisk, he leaned forward, just slightly, testing his instincts, waiting with bated breath. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps his mind, perpetually vigilant, was merely imagining things. But then, a mere 30 seconds later, Clara did it again. This time, her movements were slower, clearer, the intent unmistakably etched into each gesture. It wasn't coincidence. She's asking for help, Evan whispered. The words barely audible, a ragged breath escaping his lips. From the back of the courtroom, Detective Mallory Ross, her own instincts finely tuned, had been discreetly watching him. She moved closer, crouching beside his chair, her voice a low, urgent murmur. You see something, don't you? Mallory whispered, her eyes fixed on his. Evan nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. His voice was low, measured, devoid of any inflection. She gave the signal, twice. Mallory glanced swiftly at Clara, then back at Evan, her jaw tightening, a flicker of grim recognition in her eyes. Are you sure? She breathed, the question laced with a profound anxiety. Evan's reply was steady, his voice almost flat, devoid of any doubt. I've never been more sure of anything. He sat back, silent once more, but his formidable focus had now narrowed, sharp and absolute, to one solitary point. Clara Kane. Whatever happened next, Evan knew with an unshakable certainty that he would not ignore it. And the moment to act, he felt in his bones, was approaching with terrifying speed. The courtroom was quiet, save for the rhythmic, confident cadence of Richard Kane's voice. Smooth, assured, calculated. He leaned back in the witness chair, his hands folded neatly, his tone polished to a high sheen, like a master salesman who had never once lost a deal. The jury, mesmerized, seemed to hang on his every word, captivated by his performance. But Evan wasn't listening. His unwavering focus remained locked on Clara. She hadn't moved in nearly 10 minutes, a disturbing tableau of forced stillness. Her small hands remained folded, her shoulders still stiff, rigid, but her breathing shallow, quick, uneven, told a different, more harrowing story. Evan could discern the tension rippling beneath her stillness, a silent, internal storm trapped within the fragile vessel of an 8-year-old body. Then Richard shifted slightly, a seemingly innocuous movement, and rested his hand on the back of Clara's chair. At first glance, it appeared casual, a harmless gesture of paternal concern. But Evan saw the way Clara froze at his touch, a sudden, involuntary jolt. Her spine tightened like a wire pulled taut, a silent scream of aversion. That was it. The line had been crossed. Evan rose from his seat slowly, deliberately, with the grave, measured cadence of a soldier rising when called to post. His voice, calm yet possessing an undeniable command, carried across the courtroom, cutting through Kane's confident narrative like a razor. Your Honor, Evan declared, his voice unwavering. I need to address the court. Judge Green looked up, startled, his brow furrowing at the unexpected interruption. Sir, Judge Green stated, his voice laced with annoyance. You are not authorized to speak. Sit down immediately. Evan did not move. He stood his ground, a silent pillar of defiance. That child, he said, louder this time, his voice ringing with a fierce conviction, just gave the international distress signal twice. She is asking for help. The words struck the room like a physical blow, a hammer falling with devastating force. For a single, agonizing moment, there was silence. Absolute, stunned silence, so profound it seemed to absorb all sound. Then the murmurs began. Jurors exchanged furtive, uneasy glances. Reporters in the back rows leaned forward, their pens frozen mid-note, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Richard Kane turned slowly, his practiced smile thinning into a venomous sneer, his voice sharp and dangerous. This is ridiculous, Richard Kane exclaimed, his carefully constructed composure beginning to fracture. This man is disrupting court proceedings. I demand he be removed. His attorney, a formidable woman in her own right, shot to her feet, shouting over him, her voice shrill with indignation. Objection, Your Honor. This is harassment. Diane Kane's hand, which had been resting on Clara's shoulder, tightened with a fierce, almost cruel grip. Too tight. Clara winced, a barely perceptible flicker of pain, just enough for Evan, with his heightened awareness, to see it. Evan took a step forward, calm, controlled, utterly resolute. Look at her sleeve, Evan commanded, his voice unwavering. Left arm, pull it up. Judge Green slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing through the stunned room, his voice rising in an angry crescendo. Bailiff, remove this man immediately. But then, from the jury box, a voice, hesitant yet clear, broke through the rising tide of chaos. Juror number 4, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, leaned forward, speaking with a newfound conviction. I saw her do something with her hand earlier. Juror 4 confessed, her voice trembling slightly. Twice. I didn't know what it meant. Another juror chimed in, nodding vigorously, an expression of horrified recognition spreading across his face. And I saw marks on her arm. Juror 7 added, his voice firm. When her sleeve slipped, the murmurs in the courtroom intensified, growing louder, spreading through the gallery like widening ripples on a disturbed pond. Judge Green paused, his gavel hovering in the air, uncertainty flashing in his eyes, the carefully constructed order of his courtroom crumbling around him. Evan, his voice quieter this time, but steady and profoundly sure, uttered words that seemed to resonate through the very foundation of the room. If you ignore her now, we all fail her. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than any gavel strike could ever be. Finally, Judge Green exhaled, a long, weary sigh, and straightened in his chair, his gaze now directed with solemn weight at the small girl. This court will recess, Judge Green declared, his voice now devoid of anger, infused instead with a grim determination. The child, her guardians, and Detective Ross will join me in chambers immediately. The bailiff, a hulking figure who had previously moved to apprehend Evan, now opened the side door with a soft click, and just like that, with the turning of a key, the entire trial had irrevocably shifted. The heavy, ornate door to the judge's chambers closed with a soft, decisive thud, shutting out the agitated murmurs and the cacophony from the courtroom outside. Inside, the air was thick and still, heavy with an almost suffocating anticipation. The kind of silence that carries immense weight, pregnant with unspoken truths. Clara sat perched precariously on the edge of a large, imposing leather chair, her small legs dangling above the polished floor, her tiny fingers gripping the hem of her navy cardigan with a desperate, almost white-knuckled intensity. Beside her, Diane Kane stood rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw clenched, a mask of brittle composure. Richard Kane, restless and agitated, paced slowly near the tall, arched window, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression meticulously composed, the calculated facade of a man accustomed to absolute control, stubbornly refusing to allow even the slightest crack in his carefully constructed image. Detective Mallory Ross, her demeanor shifting effortlessly from the professional to the compassionate, knelt gracefully in front of Clara, bringing herself to the child's eye level. Her voice, soft and gentle yet imbued with an underlying steel, addressed the trembling girl. "Hi, sweetheart," Mallory began, her tone soothing. "My name's Mallory. I work with Child Protective Services. You're not in trouble, okay? I just want to make sure you're safe, that you're okay." Clara didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed resolutely on her knees, her small shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly, a fragile bird caught in a storm. Diane cut in sharply, her voice laced with an irritable edge, a protective snarl. "She's fine," Diane interjected, her tone dismissive. "She's just overwhelmed. This whole situation is incredibly confusing for her." Mallory turned her head slowly, meeting Diane's gaze directly. Her voice remained outwardly calm, but beneath its measured tone, a clear current of steel flowed. "Mrs. Kane," Mallory stated, her voice unwavering. "I need to speak with Clara alone." Richard stepped forward immediately, his voice smooth, controlled, a velvet glove concealing an iron fist. "Absolutely not," Richard Kane declared, his tone firm. "She's 8 years old. We do not consent to questioning without a guardian present. That's our right." Judge Green, seated majestically behind his grand, polished desk, adjusted his glasses with a deliberate movement and cleared his throat, a subtle signal of his authority. "Mr. Kane, Mrs. Kane," Judge Green announced, his voice low and firm, brook no argument. "I'll ask you both to step outside." Richard hesitated, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, a flicker of raw anger in his eyes. But then he forced a thin, practiced smile, a mask falling back into place. "Of course, Your Honor," Richard Kane conceded, his voice returning to its smooth timbre. "We'll wait outside." Diane lingered for a moment, her hand tightening reflexively on Clara's shoulder. A last, possessive squeeze, before finally releasing her and turning to follow her husband. The heavy door closed behind them, and for the first time, a subtle but palpable shift occurred in the room's oppressive tension. The air seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Mallory crouched lower, her eyes now perfectly level with Clara's, a silent invitation to trust. "Clara," Mallory whispered softly, her voice filled with a profound tenderness. "It's just us now. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, okay? But I saw your hand signal, and I know what it means." Clara's lips parted slightly, a fragile blossom, but no sound emerged. "If someone is hurting you," Mallory continued, her voice gentle yet firm, "we can make it stop. You are safe here, Clara, completely safe." Finally, Clara's small voice, barely above a whisper, broke the heavy silence, a tiny ripple in a vast ocean. "He told me," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with remembered fear. "No one would believe me." Mallory's throat tightened, a sharp pang of pain, but her voice remained steadfast, resolute. "Who told you that, sweetheart?" she asked, her tone unwavering. Clara hesitated, her small face clouded with a battle between fear and a burgeoning hope. Then her eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the closed door, the direction where Richard Kane had exited. "Richard," Clara whispered, the name a chilling breath. Mallory gently extended her hand, palm up, an open gesture of invitation and safety. "Can I see your arm, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Clara hesitated once more, then, with a slow, deliberate movement, pulled back her sleeve. Faint bruises, a grim tapestry of trauma, marred the pale skin beneath. Some fresh, a livid testament to recent pain, some faded, echoes of past suffering. They were of different shapes, different ages, each a silent scream. Mallory steadied her breath, her gaze hardening, and looked to the bailiff standing by the door, her expression conveying an unspoken urgency. "Get a forensic specialist," Mallory ordered, her voice now crisp and authoritative. Now, within minutes, a technician entered, carrying a small, sterile kit. Silently, meticulously, they began photographing Clara's arms and shoulders, each click of the camera echoing in the quiet chamber like evidence locking into place, sealing a terrible truth. Then came another knock at the door, a sharp rap that cut through the silence. A second bailiff stepped in, holding a sealed evidence bag, his face grim. "Detective Ross," the bailiff announced, his voice low. "We pulled Richard Kane's phone per Judge Green's order. You need to see this." Mallory opened the file on a tablet and scrolled through a series of messages, her jaw tightening with each line, each chilling word. Threats, manipulative control, harsh punishments disguised as discipline. A clear, horrifying pattern of systematic coercion and abuse unfolded before their eyes. Judge Green leaned forward, scanning the screen over her shoulder, his face grim, his features etched with a profound sorrow and anger. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and deliberate, a pronouncement of justice. "Based on this preliminary evidence," Judge Green declared, his voice heavy with authority, "I'm authorizing immediate protective custody for the child." Richard Kane's muffled voice, raised now, sharp with a raw, unbridled anger, suddenly pierced through the closed door. "This is outrageous," Richard Kane shouted, his control finally shattering. "You can't keep her from me." Inside the chambers, Clara pressed closer to Mallory, whispering so softly that Evan, standing quietly by the wall, almost didn't hear it. I don't want to go back, Clara pleaded, her voice a tiny, desperate tremor. Mallory wrapped an arm lightly, protectively, around Clara's small shoulders, keeping her voice steady, a comforting anchor in the storm. You won't, Mallory promised, her voice unwavering. Not now, not ever. In that singular, pivotal moment the battle had irrevocably shifted. But outside those closed doors, Richard Kane, a man who refused to lose, wasn't finished. Not even close. A cinematic video plays, showing a diverse group of U.S. veterans forming a silent circle around a Medal of Honor memorial. A veteran in a wheelchair is among them, his face solemn, the atmosphere deeply emotional, reinforcing themes of honor and quiet strength. 3 days after Richard Kane, leveraging his considerable wealth and influence, posted bail, the headlines exploded, ubiquitous and sensational. Cable news anchors dissected every conceivable angle, their voices urgent and dramatic, while social media platforms transformed the trial into a national conversation. A swirling vortex of outrage and debate. Some, caught up in the emotional fervor, hailed Evan as an unequivocal hero. Others, more cynical or perhaps swayed by Kane's PR machine, accused him of grandstanding, of disrupting the solemn sanctity of a federal courtroom for personal notoriety. Kane's legal team, a phalanx of the most expensive defense attorneys in D.C., was working overtime, a relentless, well-funded engine striving to control and manipulate the public narrative. In the bustling, often chaotic CPS office, Evan sat across from Detective Mallory Ross and Karen Whitfield, Clara's dedicated child advocate. A thick, daunting case file lay open between them, overflowing with chilling photographs, verbatim transcripts, and damning phone records. Mallory rubbed her forehead, her exhaustion palpable, visible in every weary line of her face. He's playing this smart, Evan, Mallory stated, her voice tight with frustration. He's hired one of the most expensive defense firms in D.C., a real bulldog team. They're aggressively pushing for an emergency motion to restore temporary custody. Evan's jaw tightened, a muscle clenching almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained even, controlled, unwavering. Over my dead body, he vowed, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Karen, her expression one of gentle determination, leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her gaze direct. We can block it, Karen explained, her tone firm yet empathetic. But we need more than just bruises and text messages. Without direct testimony, the defense will spin this easily, as nothing more than discipline taken out of context, exaggerated by an overzealous former soldier. Evan frowned, the question heavy in his eyes. You mean Clara? He asked, his voice low. Mallory nodded, choosing her words with meticulous care, fully aware of the immense burden they were asking of the child. I hate this as much as you do, Evan, truly, Mallory confessed, her voice softening with regret. But yes, we need her on record. A clear, unvarnished statement from her could shut down any attempt to send her back. It's our best shot. Evan turned slightly, his gaze drifting through the clear glass window into the small, brightly colored playroom beyond. Clara sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, coloring quietly, her beloved stuffed bear tucked securely under her arm, a silent guardian. The sunlight caught the golden strands of her blonde hair, illuminating it like a halo, but her expression was still guarded, her small body angled subtly toward the wall, as if seeking protection, shielding herself from the intrusive gaze of the room. She's 8 years old, Mallory, Evan said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion, putting her in front of strangers, making her relive everything. That's asking a lot, an unbearable amount. Karen's tone was gentle, understanding, but utterly firm in its resolve. We'll protect her, Evan, Karen promised, her eyes meeting his. No cross-examination, no terrifying courtroom confrontation. It will be a recorded session, just her and a specially trained interviewer, in a calm, safe environment. But Evan, she trusts you. She'll do this if you're there. Evan exhaled slowly, a long, drawn-out sigh, and nodded, a silent, weighty affirmation. I'll be there, he stated, the promise absolute. 2 days later, in a secure, soundproof CPS interview room, Clara sat at a small, child-sized round table, her constant companion, the stuffed bear, faithfully beside her. A soft-spoken child forensic interviewer, her face kind and reassuring, sat across from her, asking careful, open-ended questions designed to elicit truth without leading. Evan stood behind the one-way glass, a silent, vigilant observer, his hands clasped behind his back in a familiar stance, as if he were once again on ceremonial duty at the tomb. Clara's voice, though quiet, was steady, a fragile but resilient thread. She spoke, with a child's stark honesty, of rigid rules, of arbitrary punishments, and of the terrifying burden of unspoken secrets. She talked about being locked in her room for hours, alone in the darkness, about bruises hidden meticulously under long sleeves, about Diane's chilling, whispered warnings to always stay quiet, or else. 15 minutes later, the session ended. Karen emerged first, her eyes visibly damp, but a faint, relieved smile touched her lips. She did it, Karen whispered softly, her voice choked with emotion, a mixture of triumph and profound sadness. Evan nodded once, slow and deliberate, his chest tight with an intense cocktail of pride for Clara's courage and a cold, simmering anger at her tormentors. Mallory walked up behind Karen, holding a small thumb drive, the recording, tiny yet immensely powerful, that now held the potential to decide Clara's entire future. We've got her statement, Mallory declared, her voice firm, resolute. Now we fight. 2 weeks later, courtroom 3 was packed once more, overflowing with a palpable tension. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras waiting like hungry predators just outside the doors, ready to capture every dramatic moment. The nation, it seemed, was watching, captivated by the unfolding drama. This wasn't just about financial fraud anymore. Now, the searing public focus was on child endangerment, a far more visceral and emotionally charged accusation. Richard Kane sat at the defense table, impeccably composed in a dark navy suit, his expression cool, confident, almost arrogant, the unshakable certainty of a man who still believed his money, his power, could ultimately control the outcome. Beside him, Diane Kane sat stiffly, her pearl necklace glinting under the harsh courtroom lights, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, a silent portrait of forced endurance. At the prosecution's table sat Detective Mallory Ross, Karen Whitfield, and the state's formidable lead attorney, a grim phalanx of justice. Evan sat behind them in the gallery, his posture rigidly straight, his hands resting on his knees, adopting the same unyielding stance he'd perfected during years of guarding the tomb, a silent, watchful protector. Judge Green entered, his gavel striking once, a sharp crack that commanded attention. "This court is now in session," Judge Green announced, his voice devoid of emotion. The prosecution went first, their attorney, a seasoned veteran, laying out the case with a chilling simplicity. Multiple injuries meticulously documented over several months, a pattern of escalating abuse, threatening text messages, recovered from Richard Kane's phone, painting a horrifying picture of control and intimidation. And then, the linchpin, Clara's recorded testimony, verified and authenticated by CPS specialists. Then they played the video. The courtroom lights dimmed, plunging the room into a hushed twilight, and Clara appeared, small and vulnerable, on a large screen that dominated the front of the room. She sat tiny in the recording chair, hugging her beloved stuffed bear to her chest, her voice soft but hauntingly clear, ringing with an undeniable truth. He told me not to talk," Clara recounted, her voice a fragile whisper. "He said nobody would believe me. When I cried, he made me stay in my room. Sometimes he locked the door." The courtroom remained utterly silent, a profound, heavy stillness. Not even the frantic scribbling of reporters broke the reverent quiet. On the video, Clara, with a raw, heartbreaking honesty, lifted her sleeve, revealing the faint, faded bruises around her delicate wrist, a silent testament to her suffering. "I tried to stay quiet," Clara whispered on the screen, her voice filled with a child's desperate hope. "But I thought maybe someone would see me." The screen went black. Richard Kane's defense team launched their counterattack immediately, a furious, desperate barrage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the defense attorney began, her voice smooth and persuasive, attempting to reframe the narrative. "This is a tragic misunderstanding. Our client loves his stepdaughter. Those marks, accidents, plain and simple. Discipline, yes, but discipline, I assure you, is not abuse. And this so-called distress signal? A coincidence, nothing more. A child's fidget given undue significance." Richard leaned back, a confident, almost smirking expression on his face, certain his practiced charm would sway at least one juror, plant a seed of doubt. But then, the prosecution, with a devastating precision, dropped their final irrefutable piece of evidence. Metadata from Richard's phone, forensically retrieved, showing undeniable timestamps that matched Clara's statements exactly. Late-night messages, chilling photos documenting various punishments, a digital breadcrumb trail of escalating abuse. It hit the courtroom like a hammer blow, shattering the defense's carefully constructed facade. When the closing arguments finally ended, the jury filed out, their faces unreadable, burdened by the weight of their responsibility. The room sat in hushed, agonizing anticipation, minutes stretching into what felt like hours, each second a slow-motion torment. Finally, they returned. The jury foreperson stood, her voice clear and strong, resonating with profound authority. "We, the jury," the foreperson announced, her gaze unwavering, "find the defendant, Richard Kane, guilty on all counts." A collective, shuddering exhale swept through the courtroom, a wave of profound relief washing over the gallery. Mallory closed her eyes briefly, a silent prayer of gratitude. Karen reached for Evan's arm, squeezing it once, a tight, wordless gesture of shared triumph. Richard Kane, for the first time, sat utterly frozen. His jaw clenched so tight his knuckles were white against the polished table. His mask of composure finally irrevocably shattered. Clara wasn't there to witness it. She was safe, somewhere else, far away from this room, shielded from the raw drama of justice. 1 week after the verdict, the courthouse was quiet, eerily still. No cameras flashed, no reporters clamored for soundbites. The relentless chaos of the news cycle had moved on, chasing the next sensational headline. But for Clara Kane, everything had irrevocably changed. Evan stood in the small, serene courtyard outside the protective custody facility, leaning against a cool steel railing as the pale winter sun cut long, stark shadows across the pavement. He watched as Karen Whitfield, Clara's child advocate, walked toward him, a faint, weary smile gracing her lips. "She's going to live with a foster family up in Loudoun County," Karen said softly, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "Good people, a safe, loving home. No contact with Richard or Diane. Ever. Court orders are firmly in place, legally ironclad." Evan nodded, his expression calm, his voice quiet, devoid of the earlier tension. "That's good," Evan affirmed, a genuine relief in his tone. Karen hesitated for a moment, then added, a spark of warmth in her eyes. "She asked if you'd come by before she leaves." Evan followed her inside, walking through familiar hallways now lined with colorful posters and bathed in soft, inviting lighting, a stark contrast to the sterile courtrooms. He found Clara in the lounge, sitting cross-legged on a vibrant bean-bag chair, her trusty stuffed bear nestled securely in her lap. She looked up when he stepped in, and for the first time since he had met her, her smile reached her eyes, a genuine unburdened light. "You came?" Clara whispered softly, her voice full of a child's innocent wonder. Evan crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level, a gesture of profound respect. "I promised, didn't I?" Evan reminded her gently, a soft smile on his lips. Clara nodded, clutching the bear a little tighter, a small, comforting gesture. There was a brief, poignant pause before she whispered, her voice barely audible, tinged with a lingering echo of her past fear. I thought nobody would see me. Evan held her gaze, steady and warm, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. I saw you, Clara, Evan told her, his voice imbued with a quiet, powerful certainty. And you were brave enough to let me. She tilted her head slightly, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Was I brave? Clara asked, as if the concept was foreign to her. Evan smiled faintly, a complex expression that carried both immense pride and a deep, underlying sorrow for what she had endured. The bravest person in that courtroom, Clara, Evan stated, his voice resonating with an undeniable truth, was an 8-year-old girl who raised her hand and asked for help, without saying a single word. Clara's lips curved into a small, fragile smile, a budding flower. She leaned forward, a spontaneous burst of childlike affection, and wrapped her small arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. For a long, silent moment, neither of them spoke, lost in the unspoken understanding between them. Later that afternoon, Evan drove out to Arlington National Cemetery. He walked across the cold stone plaza, his boots crunching softly against the winter ground, the crisp air biting at his cheeks, until he reached the hallowed ground of the tomb of the unknown soldier. He stopped there, standing silently, his hands clasped behind his back, adopting the precise, familiar posture he'd held for years in endless solemn rotation. But today it felt profoundly different. For a decade, he had stood guard over a symbol, a powerful, abstract representation of sacrifice and honor. That day in court, he had guarded something infinitely more fragile, more precious, more immediate. A life, a voice, a future, vibrant with potential. The wind moved gently, mournfully, through the pristine rows of white marble headstones, each a testament to a life lived and lost. Evan stayed there for a long silent time, as always, a picture of profound stillness. But he carried something new within him, something weighty and profound. An unspoken promise, a solemn vow to never stop seeing the ones who couldn't speak, to never again miss the silent cries. Because sometimes, he knew now with absolute certainty, silence is the loudest cry for help. If you enjoyed the story and found it meaningful, please consider sending a super chat to help us bring you more impactful narratives like this one. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear another story that's just as compelling. This isn't just another tale. It's a visceral journey that will seize your imagination and refuse to let go. Prepare to be swept into a narrative brimming with raw, unwavering courage in the face of insurmountable odds, and a profound, heartbreaking sacrifice that will test the very limits of human endurance. At its core lies a single, agonizing choice, a decision so monumental, so fraught with impossible dilemmas, that it will dismantle your preconceived notions and force you to reevaluate everything you thought you knew about the often blurred lines between duty and justice. Is duty always righteous? Is justice ever truly served when such immense personal costs are paid? Curious to uncover the answers and challenge your own moral compass? Click on the video now to immerse yourself in this gripping, unforgettable experience.